My name is Christina Lister. I'm the marketing and audience development consultant. Been working in that field for 20 years, the last 9 or 10 as a consultant. For 6 years, I also co-ran Museum Freelance, which was a networking organisation to bring freelancers together, run training, run networking, social activities, and also do a lot of lobbying and advocacy on behalf of freelancers. So I've worked freelance, I've also worked for an agency, I've also worked in-house and commissioned freelancers, so I have quite a broad sort of perspective of experiences. I think there's quite a lot of misconceptions around what freelancers are and what they do. Certainly some people think, you know, they sort of hear some of the day rates and think there's a lot of money going around. That isn't necessarily the case, and I think the session today will hopefully debunk some of the myths and unpick those. I'm interested to know if anyone knows where the word freelance came from. So if you've got any thoughts on that, feel free to pop something in the chat box while I carry on and talk you through this morning's content. So I'll start by just giving a bit of context around sort of who freelancers are in the sector, what sort of work they do, as a good sort of starting off point. Then talk a bit about trends and the current landscape. Obviously, there's been a lot of upheaval in the sector and that's affected freelancers as well. And talk about the implications of that perhaps for museums as well. Talk about some legalities, some rights and responsibilities, best practice on commissioning and working with freelancers, what makes a good brief. And then the sort of second half of the session, I'm going to switch content round. So I'll bring the budgets and pricing forward to try to squeeze that in before 12 o'clock to make sure those of you who have to leave early get that. And then there'll be a breakout group on a few scenarios, what to do when things don't go to plan. Oh, excellent, Ruth and Padmini. Yes, you're spot on. So yeah, the term freelance was apparently first used in English in the 1800s and used to refer to a medieval mercenary who would fight for whichever nation or person paid them the most. And then over time, it sort of took on broader meaning. It was also used to refer to politicians without a particular political affiliation, who we probably call independent these days. And now, yeah, essentially refers to someone who works, but not, well, on their own terms, really, without any permanent or long-term commitment to any one employer or organisation. So firstly, just to throw out a question, if anyone wants to guess a figure in the chat box, what proportion of the sort of museum sector workforce do you think is self-employed? If anyone's got any thoughts on that, do you want to hazard a guess in the chat box? Yes, an increasing one, Ruth, that is correct. Sue, 50%. Well, we're probably heading towards that, actually. So I suppose it's a bit of a trick question because there is no absolutely definitive answer. The Character Matters report from 2016 claimed that 4.8% of the museum's workforce is freelance. But it's actually really, really hard to establish, you know, how do you get a solid figure? I think that definitely at the time probably underestimated it, but certainly now, even before COVID, the proportion of people freelancing, whether full-time or part-time, has definitely been increasing. So I suspect that would be much higher now. In the creative industries workforce, which obviously is not quite the same as the museum's workforce, it's 35%. But certainly as opportunities are increasingly shifting to sort of part-time, short-term project posts, I think the proportion of people who are freelancing at least a bit is definitely increasing. So in terms of why organisations work with a freelancer, there's such a range. And if any of you have worked with freelancers in the past and want to share sort of why, feel free to put that in the chat. But some of the common ones are a sort of lack of time, a lack of skills or experience to do something in-house, wanting to inject fresh ideas, try something new. It can be really good to get an unbiased and sort of outside perspective on some things if they're a bit controversial, a bit sensitive. So it might be that you're capable of doing the work in-house, but you want someone else to facilitate it and work through the organisation in order to do that. Also about learning from others, picking up sort of best practice from outside the organisation. I think in particular, if staff and volunteers have been there a long time, that can be useful. And if freelancers work with, you know, 5, 10, 15 organisations a year, they can pick up hopefully lots of best practice from those and bring that with them to your project. Might also be that you're in between restructure or recruitment. It might be something new that's going on, sort of digital, for example, or work that might be really outside the comfort zone of the team. So through Museum Freelance, my colleague Marge Ainsley and I ran a survey in 2020. I'm just going to share a few headline slides. There's a link to the full survey in the pack, but just to give a bit of context about who freelancers in the sector. So this had been in the making, sort of been planned. We've been planning it for months. And as it happened, we launched it at the start of March, just before the pandemic. So it was open March to April 2020. I'm glad we ran with it anyway, because even though some COVID things started to creep in, especially towards the April responses, it at least gave some form of sort of baseline data. So yeah, 83% identified as female, 16% said their day-to-day activities were limited a little or a lot because of a health problem or disability, which is higher than the museum's sector workforce as a whole from the Arts Council survey. The Equality, Diversity and Creative Case report found only 7% of the museum sector workforce were, so that's quite interesting. White people are overrepresented, and interestingly, sort of 50% work part-time. So either exclusively freelancing or freelancing alongside perhaps some study or employment or volunteer opportunities. Motivations for going freelance, I think the top ones are really as you'd expect: flexibility, freedom, work-life balance, to be my own boss. But even back in 2020, if you look at the bottom, there were also people who sort of felt forced to freelance, perhaps because they wanted to stay in the sector and couldn't find enough employed work. So they'd been made redundant, or couldn't find employed work, so to turn to freelancing. There's absolutely a huge range of freelance work that's being undertaken. I won't sort of dwell on that side, but the top 5 main freelance roles were education and learning, sort of at delivery level, interpretation, exhibitions work, evaluation and research consultation work, project management, and sort of marcoms and audience development work. And even if you look at each of those, there's such a wide variety that freelancers type of work that they do. So if you take, for example, research, it might be running focus groups, writing a visitor survey, undertaking some community consultation, analysing visitor research, researching digital audiences, really broad. They're just a few examples. Or learning, it can be delivering workshops to schools, developing a learning programme, increasingly creating digital learning resources, consulting teachers on needs. So, huge variety. In terms of growth areas that I feel are sort of becoming more and more prominent over the last 1, 2, 3 years, a lot of them are around digital engagement, monetizing digital content, running events and education programs digitally, and also advising on accessibility for digital engagement. Also a lot around decolonisation and equality, diversity and inclusion work. Green sort of sustainability, climate work as well is becoming a bigger topic, and also on health and well-being work. Essentially those kind of mirror sector trends, I would say. And actually one more point I want to make on that is, I think if you are looking for support in some of the newer growth areas, that can be a really good point, really good opportunity to really broaden and be receptive to working with people who are new to freelancing, because they're likely to have really recent experience in organizations, whereas it can be harder for more established freelancers to undertake sort of new types of work, if that makes sense. Some of the pros and joys of freelancing, again, quite what you'd expect: flexibility, control, variety of work, that sort of thing. Some of the challenges, I mean, some of these, you as clients can't do anything about, so sort of how freelancers manage their own time or deal with imposter syndrome. But there are a lot, and I've arrowed them there, which actually clients can do something about. So inappropriate day rates, poor client briefs, cash flow, not earning enough, late payments, they're all sort of linked, poor or challenging client communication, and those sorts of things. I would say freelancers don't necessarily always feel sort of part of the sector as a whole and supported by the bigger sector support organisations. And there were several changes that freelancers really wanted to see happening. So one was improved day rates and fee related issues. 2 was fairer procurement processes. 3 was more recognition and inclusion from the sector. 4, more equality of support with the PAYE, so employed workforce. Freelancers often don't have access to sort of the same free and subsidised training, for example. And the 5th one was greater visibility of opportunities. In terms of some trends and sort of the landscape, there's definitely more than there was sort of 10, 20 years ago. Like I said before, of sort of mix and matching, people coming into freelancing temporarily, then going back into employment, people combining freelancing with other types of work. I think in terms of the impact of the pandemic, there's a lot of research that we and other organisations have done showing drops of income, projects being cancelled and postponed. Some freelancers have looked for work in other sectors and may or may not return to the museum sector. Obviously impact on mental health, and also sort of varied attitudes and approaches to work in the pandemic and sort of things like virtual and in-person work. I think it's fair to say, like as the population as a whole as well, freelancers, there's been more reflection on their work-life balance, reevaluating what sort of work they want to do, how they want to do it. There's also been more discussion from freelancers in sort of communities and networks about their values and how to, what's important for them when it comes to finding projects and clients and organisations to work with. And also really an increased interest in sustainability and how freelancers should and could take responsibility for that within their work, both their own businesses and also their work with clients. So I suppose some of the implications of that for museums, I think there is quite a lot of volatility in the freelance workforce at the moment. So there has been some really experienced freelancers who've chosen to look elsewhere and may or may not return to the sector, and also a lot of new freelancers starting as well. I think it's really important for you to be really sort of clear on, if you're looking for freelance support, what your museum needs and must-haves and sort of flexibility. So just like one example, if you're doing some evaluation work, often evaluation projects, the sort of contract length can be 2, 3 or 4 years long if you get the evaluation consultant on board at the start of a project, and then you expect them to work with you throughout and then do the evaluation report at the end. So if you're after, that level of commitment, it might be, that in your procurement process, you want to really try to establish freelancers that are very committed to staying self-employed as a career, so that you don't run the risk of 6 months in, someone sort of takes an employed job and you're left looking for someone else to pick up, and it gets quite messy. Also, more freelancers are being more selective in their work, this idea of finding organisations that meet their values. So yes, there are often freelancers who will pick up any work, but equally, I think it's important that organisations really sell their work and get freelancers excited about it. So I will just pause there, I think, before I crack on, and just see if there are any questions or sort of comments or reflections about anything I've said so far. No? So I'm shaking my head. Excellent. I'll carry on, but we'll pause again for questions, and feel free to throw them out at any point. So talking a bit about sort of legalities and best practice, hopefully it won't be too dry. I suppose there's some basics that all organisations have to adhere to, and then there's kind of best practice, which maybe goes above and beyond, so a bit on top of that. And I would say that, a lot more museums now have commitments to diversity, to inclusion, to accessibility. And if that's the case in your organisation, you really need to consider how that extends and applies to freelancers, consultants and other suppliers that you work with. I should have said actually that I'm just using the term freelancers today as a sort of catch-all. There is a bit of a distinction between freelancers and consultants, even though typically, often the words are used quite interchangeably. But yeah, it's essentially someone that you're paying for a short-term project to work with you. So if you're self-employed, there are different setup options that you can choose. Sole trader is by far the most common one, certainly in our sector. There's no data, but I feel anecdotally it's going to be between 75 and 90% probably of freelancers who are sole traders. So they're self-employed, they run their own business as an individual. There are sort of pros and cons of these. Sole trader is the easiest one to set up, but you are personally responsible for your business's debt. You don't have that you don't have limited liability. I think the downside is occasionally in the bigger procurement portals, we'll see that some organisations are they will only work with limited companies. They don't want to work with sole traders. Having said that, there's been a shift which has sort of softened that a bit, because I think there's an increased focus for organisations, especially local authority organisations, to broaden the diversity of the people and organisations they work with. So you'll often now on those sorts of questions, applications get asked, you know, are you a micro business? Are you female run? That sort of thing. So there's different setup options, and I don't think there's any reason for you to be put off or favour any one of those if a freelancer is one and not the other, for example. In terms of some key client responsibility, you know, ensure it's a genuine freelance opportunity, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Obviously, if you're working on a funded project, you need to ensure that organisational and funders procurement rules apply. Make sure the freelancer is self-employed. Typically, I now see that organisations are putting that in contracts and putting that in briefs. A simple way of finding that out for your paperwork, so that you've kind of got a log of it and you've ticked that box that you've established they're self-employed, is that everyone who is self-employed has to register with HMRC, and they get a UTR, a unique taxpayer reference number. It's a 10-digit number. So you can ask that, or if they're set up as a limited company, you can ask for their company number. Ideally, you will have a contract, and we'll talk a bit more about that, or at least some kind of work agreement. If you don't have any kind of formal contract, what I sometimes have seen is that perhaps a freelancer's proposal is attached to a document that just sort of summarises some of the key things that are necessary. Check that the freelancer complies with any legal or GDPR requirements. I think the big one here is that if it's work that involves processing personal data, so for example, if it's an audience research consultant, they should be registered with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. Pay promptly as well would be another one. That's great. I'd say if you're using a group of freelancers, which you may be, so obviously you can use one freelancer who works on their own, that's the only person you have contact with. You can work with an agency, which is a set up company which employs several people on a project, or sometimes you will find groups of freelancers work together as associates, which can be a really good way of getting a broader range of experience than using just one freelancer. Typically cheaper than using an agency because the overheads are lower, and also the experience level, you're often getting several very skilled and experienced people. The only thing I'd say to you then is be really clear about who's the main point of contact, and also things like insurance. Do they all individually have their own insurance and that sort of thing? Key freelancer responsibilities. So freelancer needs to be genuinely self-employed and registered with HMRC. As I mentioned, they need to pay their own income tax and also class 2 and 4 national insurance contributions. They need to have relevant insurance, may need to be registered with the Information Commissioner's Office. And they also have the right, just so you're aware, they have the legal right to charge statutory late payment fees. And that comprises interest, which is 8% plus the Bank of England base rate, and debt recovery costs, which are £40 to £100 depending on the value of the unpaid invoice. I've never known anyone to actually charge this, because obviously you don't want to burn any bridges as a freelancer with a client, but just know that there is the legal right for them to do that. And sometimes I know a couple who have pointed that out to clients just as a way of encouraging and speeding up late payment. In terms of insurance, it's a bit of a minefield. The common ones that organisations will ask freelancers to have are professional indemnity insurance and public liability. often, especially organisations that are run via a local authority, will have a sort of standardised expectation, and that can be that those levels are 5 million or 10 million pounds each. I would just encourage you to really consider whether that level is necessary, or at least only expect that level of the freelancer if they win the contract, and then they can top up their insurance level. I'd say a common level for freelancers to have would be 1 million for each. So I mentioned earlier about sort of PAYE in disguise briefs, which is something that we've been seeing a lot more of. So this is where it's supposed that it's a piece of work that essentially really should be categorized as probably a part-time but employed position. And for various reasons, whether knowingly and naughtily or just not really understanding the difference, an organization puts it out as a freelance role. So really avoid doing that. If you're not sure, there are links here and links in your pack to HMRC has a quiz that you can take as an organization, or a freelancer can take, asking a series of questions, which will help at the end kind of kick out an answer as to whether that position should be classified as self-employed for tax purposes or an employed position. There's also a link in the handout pack to the creative and cultural skills guide on working with the self-employed, and just in the top right here there's just a screen grab. So in that pack it has sort of some tips. So if the following are true, it can be reasonably assumed that someone is a freelancer. So they have a business for themselves, they can decide what they do, where, when and how, they can hire someone else to do the work, and so on. Somebody is probably self-employed if they put in bids, gives quotes, they're not under direct supervision. I think some red flags will often be if you include a very prescriptive job description when you are looking for someone, a person specification as well. Those two don't tend to be how you put out freelance work. Also being really restrictive about when and where the work needs to be. So for example, Monday to Wednesday in our offices, 9 to 5 p.m. That's an employed position, really, not a freelance one. And also often a medium or longer term commitment. So 3 days a week, perhaps for 6 months or 12 months or that sort of thing. I'll just pause there because I've seen there's a couple of questions. Is there anything between a freelancer and a salaried role? How do you mean, Stephen? Do you mind just clarifying that one?
Yeah, I was just mindful of I mean, obviously it's not museums, is the Uber case where I think there was a court ruling whereby I think they clarified that people working for Uber aren't freelancers, but I think they weren't either salaried either, and I don't know whether there's any in between.
Oh, interesting. I've not come across that there's any in between stage, to be honest. I think normally, I think normally the HMRC guidance is helpful, and I do think that creative and cultural skills toolkit is quite helpful as well if you're not sure. I mean, often what happens is an organisation will think, will think, it's a £20,000 or £25,000 a year position. Oh, let's put it out as a freelance contract because then we've got more flexibility and, don't have to contribute for sick pays and holidays and pensions. So it's going to save us a bit of money, and divide that salary by a number of working days in the year to equate to a day rate, which ends up being quite low. And that's often where some of the problems start. I've not come across if there's anything in between. I think there can be a grey area, and I know some of the discussions that have come up in forums have been actually when organisations have been really well intentioned and well meaning and done things like let freelancers sort of pay for them to do training, bring them into staff parties and that sort of thing, which maybe starts to blur some of the lines a bit. So in terms of thinking about commissioning and working with freelancers, these are some principles that Museum Freelance we worked up with Southwest Museum Development, and there's some guides in the pack which break these down in more detail. But essentially, you can sort of choose which you want to apply to your organisation. But they were fairness, inclusion and accessibility, transparency and honesty, respect and commitment. And I'm going to talk about a few of those in a bit more detail. So I suppose firstly, what does fairness look like? Has anyone got any thoughts if you are looking to work with a freelancer? How can you do that in a fair way? Any thoughts on do's or don'ts for fair commissioning?
Non-biased recruitment.
Yeah. Any thoughts on how you would achieve that?
Oh, I mean, there's sort of computer programs now, even obviously designed on the side of the work, that can run diagnostics, isn't there, to sort of make sure that you're not applying sort of subconscious bias and gender bias and things like that.
Yeah, there is. I've got a bit more on that as well in a slide or two. That's a really
also sort of being up to speed with where to advertise, because we tend to just think, oh, it's just the sector, so we'll just do sector sites rather than maybe like broader charity sites or art sites and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really big one, and I think it's a huge one to unpick, because on the one hand, I suppose you think to make it as fair and transparent as possible, you want to get your brief out there in as many places as possible. But equally, if that, which I've seen it do, gives you 60 or 100 applications for a piece of work that's, like £1,000, that's quite onerous for you to actually trawl through all those applications. And will you genuinely then set aside the time to look at all those in a really fair way for a very small piece of work, and also treat those freelancers fairly, so get back to them, for example? So there can be a case for, certainly with smaller pieces of work, maybe not going out with it quite as far, but then there's a question of where you put the briefs out, especially if you're trying to get beyond sort of maybe some usual suspects. Similarly, I know freelancers that if they see a brief on every single procurement portal and on every single newsletter, they're reluctant to apply for it, because they just think, oh, everyone is going to go for this and my time is better spent on something else because my chance of getting it is quite small. So it's a really difficult one.
That's a lot to juggle, isn't it? Because you've hit the nail on the head there, really, because if you're going to do EDI and fairness and things like that properly, you do have to attach that resource to it, and it will, like you say. But then obviously that's a really difficult thing to juggle, because I can understand from a freelancer's perspective
it is a
why you wouldn't go for it.
I mean, I think some of the things, these are just a few. I think someone's put it in there, Padmini's put it in there, that it's a genuine freelance opportunity. Things like being really clear on a closing date and adhering to it, so obviously not withdrawing it sort of sooner. A lot of these are a bit, in terms of actually fair commissioning of freelancers, would be similar to fair recruitment of employees as well. You haven't already got someone in mind, and this can happen because there's someone who really knows your organisation, they're a safe pair of hands, you trust them, they can hit the ground running because you've worked with them before, but maybe the funding requirements specify that you have to get at least 3 quotes or 5 quotes. That's a difficult one, because, personally, I'd rather you just went with that freelancer than I was asked to quote for something which I never genuinely stood a realistic chance of getting. I think also it's about making your requirements proportional to the scope and budget of the project. So if it is something for £500 or £1,000, not expecting freelancers to put in as much work to pitch as they should be for something that's £5,000, £10,000, £20,000, for example. I'm going to be quoting a bit from Stockton Arts Centre, who last year came out with a freelance policy that kind of set the world on fire, and freelancers just loved. And they have very generously said, there's a link to it in the pack, and they've actually very generously said that anyone can copy, lift from, be inspired by their policy. which is great. So they say, we acknowledge that freelancers have to make provision for your own sick pay, holiday pay, pension, training and development and other costs within your fees. So we expect rates to be higher than the salaried equivalent, which is great. And we value freelancers' time and will seek to streamline contact time and meetings and save travel time and costs by offering opportunities to talk by phone or meet online. Certainly, I think the pandemic's opened up more and more opportunities. It's sort of become more standard to do interviews by Zoom or Microsoft Teams, for example. So I'd say just be really clear on your expectations and requirements. If you're happy to do both the interview process, if you do one, and all meetings with the freelancers remotely, great. If you have expectations for in-person meetings, also be really transparent on that, because then it's up to, you don't want to waste anyone's time in applying if currently they don't feel comfortable with in-person meetings, or actually they live so far away that it's just not financially worth their while then to apply for the job. In terms of inclusive and accessible as well, that's also about extending your values to your suppliers and freelancers. So here's just a few examples. You know, we talked a bit about where you'd share your brief, allowing really at least 2 weeks for responses. Sometimes they're very, very short turnarounds. Sometimes those turnarounds are over the Christmas holidays, for example, which, you know, is going to limit the pool probably of who applies. Only ask for specific criteria if necessary. Fair museum jobs, some of you might be familiar with, they do a lot of work around this, which also applies to freelancers. So don't expect people to have a degree unless that truly is critical for the work. Having decent, adequate budgets, which we'll come on to talk about. Reducing unconscious bias, which someone mentioned earlier. So, you know, really taking assertive and positive steps to remove variance that, you know, applicants face, and reducing your unconscious bias in your process. So firstly, I think aiming to identify and understand if there are any prejudices in the process. You can check the language that you use in the brief, make sure that, you know, check whether the specification unnecessarily excludes certain people from applying. Also standardizing and structuring the process. So having clear assessment criteria that you're transparent with. So, you know, for example, 20% of the scoring will be on this and 30% will be on this. So freelancers are clear, you and your team are clear. Also involve several people ideally in shortlisting and interviewing. So it's not one person's perhaps biases that project on the process. And again, from Stockton Arts Centre, we will ask if freelancers have any access requirements when we start working with you. We endeavour to meet the access requirements of all members of staff, including freelancers, and to fulfil access riders, which is essentially an access document or statement which outlines someone's access needs. This is above and beyond anything I've seen with anyone else. It's sort of really best practice to aim for. And then finally, in terms of transparency, so, you know, just a few tips here. This might sound really obvious, but some briefs miss this. So, you know, providing contact details. So if a freelancer wants to follow up with questions, they know who to contact, and make sure that person then isn't about to go on leave for a couple of weeks, which sometimes happens. Being clear on your selection criteria, being clear on the process and dates, providing feedback, you know, if at all possible, as a minimum for people you interview or who get to sort of a shortlisted stage. Keeping records as well of procurement processes and decision criteria and decisions, partly perhaps for your own records, but also some funders might wish to inspect that and see proof of what you've done before. And there's an interesting one where it comes to procurement portals, which are these websites where you have to register as a freelancer and click to say you're interested in an opportunity. The idea is really good, I think, behind them in principle, because it means that you have a period typically where people who are interested can ask questions. Those questions are shared and the answers are shared with everybody who's expressed an interest in that piece of work. So the idea is that everybody benefits from the same information, regardless of whether you ask the question or not. But some organisations perhaps take it a bit too far. I was contacted by someone in January saying they have a piece of audience development work, and I had to register on this portal and express my interest, and then they would allow me access to the brief. I was quite busy and said, I'm not going to be able to even start anything till April. Can you just let me know when the starting point is? So essentially, I'm not wasting a load of time when I know that I can't do it if they need someone to start in March. And they hadn't told me the budget or anything like that either. And they said because of transparency reasons, they weren't allowed to answer any question like that until I'd signed up for the procurement portal, which I didn't do because I just decided that was a waste of my time, and I didn't sort of agree with how they were running that process. Also procurement portals, and I know some organisations have to go through them, especially for bigger pieces of work, but there are a lot of freelancers who just won't apply for them because the bureaucracy involved is just really, really excessive. It can be several days worth of time to adhere to them. So again, from Stockton Arts Centre, we always agree fees and payment schedules in advance and are honest and upfront about what we can afford. This is just quite mind-blowing. We expect freelancers to scale the activity to fit within the available fee, not to reduce your fee or work unpaid hours. We want freelancers to tell us if our expectations are bigger than the fee available. So sometimes it's just because perhaps an organisation, they're putting out a piece of work because they're not experts in that field. So it follows then perhaps that, it is hard to gauge what is an adequate budget and what you can expect for certain amounts of money in return. So it's also then about having that conversation with freelancers. There are ways around that as well. A couple of years ago, there was an organisation, they'd benefited from a big amount of funding, and they were putting out probably about 10 pieces of work in all sorts of different areas, sort of fundraising, I think collections or archives, and then they had audience development and marketing, and they couldn't quite decide whether they should form part of one brief or whether they were two separate pieces of work that might be done by two separate people or organisations, and ended up paying me for about 1 day's worth of my time as someone who works in marketing and audience development to help them establish whether they should be one or two briefs. And in that case, we decided on two, and also what the briefs should say and what the appropriate budget was and what they should be looking for. I then obviously pulled myself out of that. I wasn't going to apply because that would have been a conflict of interest if I'd helped write the briefs for that piece of work. But when it comes to really big project fees like that, that could be something that's, money well spent if you get someone just to help you with a few hours, just to really make sure that your brief really is clear on what you're after, and that will help you get the most appropriate person. This is an interesting one, again, from them, about offering freelancers the opportunity to observe a board meeting to try to be as transparent as possible. I think it's a really nice gesture. I think most freelancers, unless they're paid for that, probably wouldn't take them up on that. But I saw, for example, London Museum of Water and Steam, that's a brilliant community, small museum. They're starting something I think they're calling Freelance Fridays, where they're sort of allowing freelancers to come in and hot desk and just sort of to use some of their space and become a bit of part of their community, which is fantastic. In terms of kind of putting all that into a brief, this can be quite tricky, but essentially, make it proportional again with the size of the project. You want to be really clear on what you're after, and provide enough detail so so freelancers looking at it think, oh, that's for me, I've got the skills and experience, yeah, I'm going to apply. But perhaps don't be too prescriptive, leave a bit of flexibility and freedom, or say in the brief that you're also open to hearing different methodologies or whatever it might be as well, because freelancers might be able to bring that expertise to the project. Being really clear and having also adequate timescales for the work and the tendering process, being realistic in what can be achieved. I'll come on to talk about this one. Ideally, a disclosed and appropriate budget in the brief, but appreciate there may be times when you don't do that. Being transparent on the shortlisting and appointment criteria, and like I said earlier, sort of having an element of you selling the work. I would say even if it's a sort of £500 piece of work and you know who you want to send it to, and you can just send it to that person, you don't have to go through a procurement process, I think it's still quite a good discipline to have a brief for you just to go through that activity of writing a few bullet points. It really helps you focus on what you need and give you some clarity on what you're after and what the deliverables and all the outcomes will be. And it can also form the basis of a contract as well. So these are some typical sections in a brief, and there's an example brief that's linked to in the pack as well, but you do really want to tailor it for your project. So I think a lot of these are quite self-explanatory. I would really also recommend now that you are really clear on whether the work needs to be delivered in person or whether it can in part be done virtually as well. So I mentioned earlier about budgets in briefs, and I totally understand that there are reasons why you might not put a budget in a brief. Ideally, I think it's helpful if you do, because you can then compare like for like. You're always going to have a maximum cap, and you don't want to waste your time and you know reading responses that are really not aligned with your budget, and you don't want to waste freelancers' time. So if you don't put a budget in, say you ask for some kind of like a digital learning strategy, you might get responses back for £2,000, £5,000 and £10,000, but the contents aren't necessarily going to be the same. So it's really hard for you then to compare like for like. And all three of them might have been able to create a proposal for £5,000, and you could have then compared, the strength of ideas, the creativity, their experience, the value for money, that sort of thing in that way. And again, there are very established and experienced freelancers who won't tend to go for work not knowing the budget. So you can also be missing out on good candidates there. I think it's better to put an overall budget in, or if you really don't feel comfortable with that, perhaps a budget range or an indicative budget. And I'd also say, I know sometimes, especially for things like learning delivery work or things like that, often there is a day rate in the brief. Unless that is really necessary, I would avoid that and put in the overall fee, because on paper it feels like a quick, easy comparator looking at day rates to see, well, who's offering better value for money. But someone charging £400 a day might be really experienced. They might subscribe to information, tools that speed up their work. They've created templates. They just know what they're doing. So they can do something in 5 days, so for £2,000, which might take someone less experienced 10 days to do at £200, and both are the same amount. So it's not necessarily the case that someone who's got a lower day rate is better value for money. Similarly, if you are looking at people with bigger day rates, try to identify if they are offering something that the people on the lower day rates aren't. So I will just pause there, I think, and see if there are any questions on that cantering through, and then we've got sort of a last question before we go to a break. Okay, so has anyone got any thoughts on this one? How to compare responses once you have them in and choose a freelancer? Anything that's worked well for you in the past, or any place you've got stuck? Is there anyone who wants to unmute to share any reflections?
Yes, I'm happy to offer one. We were asking for a freelancer for fundraising, and it was very interesting to see the range of responses that we got. I got people who were on a higher rate, but who were talking about a strategic, well, we'll write this, but they weren't actually proposing to put any bids in. And what we were really looking for was a doer, somebody who'd got the experience but would actually just go ahead and do it. Because I'm a very good fundraiser, but I'm supposed to be running a museum at the same time. So really, I needed somebody who'd got that experience, whom I could trust just to get on with it and do what I would do, but who also had fundraising contacts that I didn't have again, you know, where you don't want somebody who's exactly the same as you. You want somebody who's bringing something you don't have. And in that case, it was relatively easy to tell the difference between them, because some people were proposing to spend their time. The budget was the same, as you say, but it wasn't about their day rate or how much they were or were not. It was about whether they were doing what we needed them to do. And one particular person stood out as understanding the sort of arts and culture kind of fundraising scene, as it were, but also were proposing to spend their time in delivery rather than putting together a case for support that we were then expected to deliver. So the responses were actually, it was really clear who was actually fulfilling what we wanted them to do.
Excellent. Well, that's really good. I mean, I think it's like you say, Sue, sort of it's really about going back to identify what's most important to you in the project. So you get that weighting in, you know, you were saying you wanted a doer, for example. So, you know, if that's clear in the brief, and then also how are you going to establish who is that doer or who has the skills you need and perhaps something on top that you also don't have in the organization. So is it that they've done similar projects in the past? Is it about some kind of approach that you're really after a particular approach? Is it that they're an experienced and safe pair of hands because there's a, you know, the project's really complicated and it's maybe sensitive? Sometimes also it's about establishing a connection and a fit, sort of chemistry. If it's, sometimes I know organizations prefer someone who's local because they want that local on the ground knowledge and perhaps contacts with community groups, and the project's going to have lots of on-site visits. Also thinking if there's a sort of trade-off anywhere, whether you want to ask for references, whether you want to ask for case studies. I think it's always good to look for freelancers who've tailored their response to you, because it can be a temptation for freelancers who are applying for a lot of work to have a standardized, oh, they've asked for my CV, winner, here you go, and here's my 2 paragraphs about me. So, you know, how can you tease out that they have understood your brief and that they are the right person for it, and maybe, you know, they've taken that little bit of time to also tailor their response to your organization, following, you know, whatever instructions. So again, if it's a smaller budget, what can be really helpful for you and freelancers is to limit the response size and say no more than, I've seen no more than 2 pages of A4. And I think great, because they're then respecting my time, and I'm going to be doing 2 pages and so is everyone else. So if I do 5 pages, that's not going to make me look better by sharing more of my work. If anything, that will make me look worse because I haven't followed the instructions. So Helen, you've got your hands up.
I think you've just answered what I was going to say. That was my point, was that quite often you can get these sort of very standardized responses, and really you're looking for someone that's really connected with your project or really understood what the outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Definitely. I'd say, and I've got an example of that on the next slide actually. I'd also say, so I've worked in an agency and I've worked with a lot of agencies, and it can be really tempting because their responses are often really glossy, these beautiful PDFs with really nice graphics, and they've worked on all these amazing names, and you think, oh wow. And actually, and yes, chances are then you might have a team of 5 people to contribute their ideas and expertise in versus 1 freelancer or 1 consultant. I would just say, if you're a smaller organization, you might be a very small fish in a very big pond. So, you know, your £5,000 project might be quite a small bit of income for that agency, and they might not necessarily, it might be a fabulous agency, but they might, once they've won the work, you know, not be prioritizing you because you're not a global name that boosts their creds that they will use to pitch to other people. And, you know, they're also doing £75,000 pieces of work. So it's just something to be a bit wary of. Also being really clear, if people are pitching a team, really understanding who is going to be doing the work. So it's not that the MD of the agency and the more senior people, you know, they come in, they're interviewed, they talk the talk, but actually it'll be more junior members of the team doing the work. They might be absolutely, totally adequate and have great credentials too, but you just want to know. So, you know, if you are comparing with other freelancers and consultants, you really know who would actually be your main point of contact and who would be delivering the piece of work. This is an example that I just saw this week, which I thought was really interesting. So this is from Rumbear Dance Company. It's not for a freelance brief. It's that they're looking for a fan-based marketing manager, which is an employed position. The link is there, and they had a brilliant website, really about, and they were very clear. I read that and thought, yeah, they're genuine in their sort of concept about trying to invite a broad range of people to apply. And you know, even they explicitly said, don't worry if you don't feel you meet all the requirements. We're still interested to hear from you. But what I think we can learn from this one also is they asked 3 questions for applicants. So it's fan-based marketing manager. It's about building and retaining relationships with audiences. So we want our emails to serve the brand, but it's vital they serve the audience. What makes a great, rewarding, engaging email, including for people who are not the usual suspect dance fanatics? Second question, look at their website. What 2 or 3 things might you suggest someone new to Rumbear checks out first? Third question, have you used A/B testing, analytics, segmentation, etc. in email? Sorry, how have you in email marketing previously, and what have you learned from this? And I think this approach is really clever because it's not just, here you go, here's my CV. You know, the last question, how have you used this? That really, if that's a core part of that person's, in this case, job description, you're ascertaining whether they have that valid experience. The second one also is about, you know, ideas. And again, people have to go to the trouble of looking on the website. So, you know, that might be just asking 1 or 2 questions like that about your organization can be really helpful, because, you know, I think that is more palatable than what sometimes happens with big research and evaluation briefs, where clients will ask freelancers and consultants for their entire research methodology, including things like sample sizes and where, you know, how they're going to promote and where they're going to get people to sign up for surveys from and all this sort of thing. And actually that level of detail is work that should be paid for. That shouldn't be part of the pitching process. Whereas something like this, you know, maybe you put a word limit, say like 50 words, 100 words, it doesn't have to be big. That can be really, really useful. So I make it 11:27. So I thought we'd pause here for a break. And I suggest if we return at 11:35, that's 8 minutes. Hopefully that's 7, 8 minutes. Hopefully that's enough for you all. And that just means that the bit on budgets and pricing will have time to do that before some of you have to leave at 12. So I'll be lingering if anyone wants to keep chatting, ask questions or comments, but otherwise I'll see you in a few minutes. So welcome back, everybody. Just very briefly, a bit on sort of contracts, work plans and working effectively. Ideally, if you can have a contract, when we ran Museum Freelance, we talked to various legal people to try to create and buy a contract template that we could then provide or sell in some form. But everyone we spoke to weren't keen on doing it because they said, oh, everything has to always be tailored to each opportunity. And there would have been so many caveats that it sort of didn't feel like the right thing to do. In the handout pack, there is a link to a sort of generic one that's not from our sector. And I know there are a couple of sector support organisations looking at potentially trying to commission a template contract, because I know a lot of organisations don't have one and some freelancers don't have one either. But, you know, even if you don't have a formal one, and I don't like all the legal speak that no one can understand anyway, you know, so, you know, even if it's just a couple of pages that sets out, you know, both parties' responsibilities, timescales, deadlines, payment, you know, all that sort of thing, and perhaps something on, you know, what to do when things go wrong. I think that's a really good idea. And especially after so many freelancers were totally left stranded in sort of March, April, May, June 2020, where work just disappeared and they didn't have any contracts or any sort of kill fees or anything to claw any of their money back. I think a lot of freelancers are now a lot more switched on and are very nervous or reluctant to start projects without some kind of contract. My insurance company actually requires me to have one. So I have to always ask for one, even for a sort of 2-hour workshop, which can be a bit annoying for some organizations, but you know, that's it really. Another, like I said earlier, it can be quite common to attach a proposal or a work plan and say that, you know, that forms the basis of kind of a contract. But just before we go on to talk about budgets, in terms of effective working relationships, and there's more on this in the handout pack, one big thing I would say is that it can be really tempting, and I know I've done it before, if you're really, really busy, to just think, brilliant, freelancer, boom, off you go. But to get the best out of them, you know, you need to invest some time into briefing them and giving feedback, you know, sort of promptly, and working with them really. Also sort of linked to that onboarding as well. Making sure that, you know, they're clear on who their contacts are and how you prefer to be communicated with, email, phone, weekly meeting. Some people use WhatsApp. Being really clear on outputs and responsibilities and milestones. Being clear on payment and when payment invoicing should happen, when payment should be made. Having a sort of a degree of respect and trust between the both parties as well. Being really clear and agreeing on what evaluation criteria, what success looks like for the project. Mentioned contract and work plan, and if it is something like you know, a graphic designer's creating a new education leaflet or some kind of interpretation panels or anything like that, you know, being generous with crediting the freelancer as well and allowing them to use that in future work is really helpful. So in terms of budgets and pricing, I like this, and I think it is worth remembering this. I think it's fairly accurate. You know, we want the world, but to get excellence quickly, overnight and cheaply is perhaps a bit of a myth. I do know some graphic designers now who charge a 5% rush fee. So if someone comes to them with something with a quite tight turnaround, they might decide to do it. As a result, they'll need to postpone another piece of work. So then they charge 5% extra for that, for example. So the Museum Freelance Survey in 2020 found that around half of freelancers charge between £200 and £400 a day. That in itself is quite a broad category. So this is more of a breakdown. You know, remember that only in the survey, only 1 in 5 freelancers feel that they are paid an appropriate day rate. So this isn't saying these are appropriate day rates. These are saying on average what freelancers are paid in the sector. When you start getting to certainly under £100 a day, but even £100 to £150 a day, possibly even slightly more than that, once you account for all the freelancers' expenses, insurance, pension, tax, national insurance, and the fact that they can't spend all of their time, however efficient they are, on fee earning work, some of those day rates really start going into barely scraping minimum wage. So I think it's just a bit of an awareness around what that day rate comprises, because otherwise it can sound like a lot, sort of £200 a day, when in fact it's really not. If you want to see more of a breakdown, the survey, this is just an example, has sort of this level of breakdown. So for all those types of work that you saw at the start of the session, you can see in numbers how many freelancers answered each of those. So if you have no idea where to start, you know, this might be a good place. There's also some other additional guides to day rates in the pack. There's some in the sector that we don't rate, that are out of date and far too low. Shout out to Padmini. I always talk about the Oral History Society's guidance. I think that's really useful, and also breaks it down by different types of work. Typically strategic work, people will charge more for that. Also niche work that maybe not so many people can do, that requires quite a lot of expertise. For example, there's someone who works a lot in terms of GDPR and data protection and privacy. I literally know one person who does that. Whereas, you know, you saw earlier that learning work at delivery level, for example, that's something that a lot of people do. So it's, you know, that tends to be a sort of lower day rate for those. So yeah, I think this is where a lot of the problems around day rates start, where it's easy to think, okay, we'll take a £30,000 employed salary, divided by the number of working days a year, and potentially even take off a few weeks for holiday, and that gives us a freelance day rate that's adequate. And if you did that, it would be about £132 a day. But it's really misleading. For a start, an employed salary isn't all, that's not the only cost to an organisation of that employee. You know, there's all sorts of other costs that the organisation will pay, recruitment costs, all sorts of overheads and expenses, training, pension, national insurance, loads of other costs that go on top of that as well. But then also for freelancers, a day rate needs to cover a lot more. So business expenses, you know, anything from your laptop and all your virtual video screens and everything that everyone needs now, memberships, sometimes travel, things like that. A really big one, which I think not enough people sort of understand enough about, is that, how, like I say, however efficient a freelancer works, you cannot spend 100% of your time on billable work that you can charge someone for, because there will always be, you will always need to spend time on things like some tech and IT troubleshooting, marketing yourself, pitching, you know, writing, well, finding the briefs and then writing those proposals in the first place. Also, ideally, spending some time on your own training and CPD, and just admin, you know, getting your insurance, tidying your emails, all of that sort of stuff. So typically that can account for 20 to sometimes even 40% of your time. So, you know, for a lot of freelancers, actually, they can only earn money for 60 to 80% of time. And that's then might be even less if you're thinking, well, they're going through a quiet spell. Tax and national insurance is another one. Time off, like I mentioned, so quiet spells, but also holidays and illnesses, you need to build up some money for to cover, because no one's paying you for that time. Pension contributions, ideally, although 57% in our survey of freelancers are not currently saving for pension, which is another sort of ticking time bomb. But so, for example, if you do a 2-hour workshop, you know, this is all the other stuff that might take up time. So a client might think, well, they're doing 2 hours workshop, bit of prep, job done. But, you know, it's about understanding the needs, writing a proposal, perhaps preparing and signing a contract. Paperwork to register as a new supplier can be quite labour intensive. Liaising over content or promotions, developing the content. If you're doing it in person, travelling, you have to arrive early or do a tech test, having travel expenses. And then obviously after the session itself, any kind of wash-up conversation, evaluation, invoice tracing payments. So this was kind of what I was referring to. A few of us were talking in the break earlier, what Stephen was saying, that, you know, all those wraparound jobs might be about similar in length to a 2-hour workshop to a 5-day project. So if they take you 2 or 3 hours of time, that's a much bigger proportion if you need to account for that, if you're doing it, charging for a 2-hour workshop delivery. This is something I put together for some training a few years ago for freelancers, just to really be sort of honest about cash flow fluctuations. So this was a year of mine several years ago, and the pink line you can see are the hours I worked throughout the year. So the sort of first half of the year, pretty sort of spread evenly, bit of a peak in July, and then I think I must have gone on holiday in August because that was lower, and again up again in October, and sort of tailed off a bit towards December. The purple line is the line showing the proportion of my annual income that I invoiced each month. So you can see some months it was nothing. February, April, nothing, and basically nothing in May, August and December, with some big peaks in between. And then the green line shows when I received the payment, the sort of proportion of my annual income when I received the payment, which interestingly sort of at the start of the year mirrors a bit the purple line, but then starts to shift. So obviously is later over the summer, and then November, December hasn't actually caught up to the big spike of work that I invoiced for in October. So, you know, really this is just to encourage organisations and freelancers to get everything ready they can at the outset. So have agreed payments. A lot of freelancers, you know, really now try to, for example, ask for bigger projects, 25% upfront, maybe then staggered instalments throughout the length of the project. Also making sure that you get your supplier forms filled out, get your purchase order at the outset, so you're not then chasing those at the end. And then another example from Stockton Arts Centre, which is very unusual, but they try to pay freelancers within 14 days of receipt of invoice. And again, a lot of big organisations, local authority run, you know, you're probably going to have standard procedures and that sort of thing. But you know, that might be 28 days or 30 days, so that might not be possible. I'd say if you're unsure about budgets and day rates and don't really know where to start, there are some sector guides and there are links to all these in the pack. So, you know, you can look at those. Sometimes you can ask your funder, ask in relevant communities. So things like the GEM, GISMAIL for education and learning work, for example. You can also ask relevant sector support organisations. So the Arts Marketing Association, for example, if it's marketing work. You can ask museums community on Twitter, on LinkedIn. People are always, you know, happy to chip in and pay. And like I say, if it's, you know, if it's really a bit of a beast, if it's something really quite substantial and you really want to make sure you get it right, you could also perhaps pay a small amount of money, just a few hours, to get someone to help you identify exactly what it is you need and what an appropriate sort of budget might be. Are there any? I will pause there and just open up the videos and see. I'd be really interested to hear if there are any questions, comments or reflections on the pay stage. Oh, thank you, Padmini, for linking in to that guidance as well. Does anyone?
I was going to say, looking at your graph, that it looks as though you're paid on time at the end of the financial year, which obviously might.
Oh, what, in March?
Yeah, so maybe that's because the client might have deadlines.
Oh, interesting.
Yes,
Money
good
out. Point. Yeah. That's a good point. Yes, that often happens. And actually what sometimes happens is there are organisations who will want you to charge invoice up front, like early in Jan, Feb or March, because organisations have budget to spend and maybe the work's not going to be delivered till April and beyond. That happens this time of year as well. Any sort of any other questions or reflections or comments otherwise on budgets?
Yeah, I was wondering sort of how much time you spend in the non-billable, so in other words, you know, pitching for work, and whether that affects what you set your day rate at.
Really good question. So I think technically it should do. I don't think it does for a lot of freelancers. I spent a few years in a PR agency years ago, so I got into very good habits. We kept timesheets, and it was just ingrained in me. So back in those days, it was an Excel sheet, and now I use something called Toggle, T-O-G-G-L, which is free, and it tracks my time. So it can be an app. You can use it just on your desktop, and I can create I've got headings for every single client, sometimes for bigger client projects, maybe even breakdowns. And I then personally, I have 5 categories for non-billable time. So I have marketing, new business, admin, finance, and training. And for everything I do, I try to account for my time by and large, you know, a 5-minute here or there, maybe not. You can either press start and then pause, or you can retrospectively go back and sort of allocate yesterday's time. So I always tell freelancers, they really should be doing that, because you have no idea otherwise if you're over servicing or under servicing a project. Whereas if you're tracking your time, you said this would take 2 days, you do the project, Toggle tells you it took 4 days, you have to then try to unpick and learn from that as a freelancer. You know, is it because you're a perfectionist, which I hold my hand up, and you just, you know, want to keep fine-tuning things and then get it out there? That's not a sustainable and viable way of making a decent income in the long run. So you have to do something about that. Is it that there was a lack of communication? You know, are there things that going into your next project you can change so that, or do you have to estimate more time next time? So I think that sort of thing is up to the freelancer to take responsibility for. And I suppose, yes, in one way, I know someone who is a coach who works in professional services, so with a lot of lawyers and bankers. Their day rate is £1,300 to £1,400 a day. But their business model is very different, because they only spend 25% of their time on actual fee earning work. It takes them, they invest 75% of their time in trying to get that work through going to networking events, speaking at things free of charge, going on people's podcasts, all that stuff. And they will get the work. And because the day rate's so high, only 25% of their time is spent on that sort of work. That's a totally different business model, which I don't see anyone doing in our sector. That's, you know, not how it is. but yeah, it's an interesting point. I think the more experienced freelancers, obviously, chances are it's quicker for them to apply for, you know, some of those categories might be smaller because you've got your bank of case studies, you've got your website which you can link to. So certainly some of those percentages might be a bit lower. Equally, you know, I think if someone's spending 95% of their time on client work, that might also send alarm bells, because, you know, I think it's healthy to invest some time, if not money, into training in CPD. Otherwise, 10, 15 years down the line, are you still talking about, you know, is your approach really keeping up with sort of trends in the sector?
Thank you so much, Christina, for all the work that you've provided on this. I think it's going to be really helpful for us, for MD too. So I'm really thankful for that, and I wish you all the best in your coming freelancer work.